So I'm going to give a brief overview of the book and talk about how I got the idea to do it, and then talk about a couple of the buildings in it. And then Amy and I are going to have a little bit of a conversation afterwards so that we can talk a little bit more about some of the buildings that I don't talk about in my presentation. So when I moved to Houston, I came to Texas to go to graduate school at Rice. I had never been to Texas before, and I didn't think anything about it. I lived all over the country. My parents were corporate nomads. We'd been East Coast, West Coast, Atlanta, everywhere. And we didn't know much about Texas. And so we thought, oh, it's going to be tumbleweeds, cowboys, desert, everything. And then we get to Houston and it looks like this. And we're like, we're used to suburbs and suburbia and stuff, but this is something else. This is pretty weird and, quite frankly, kind of scary. So I was intrigued. You know, we get to Houston, and this was the mid '90s, and I think the economy was still kind of recovering from the oil crash. And Houston is a huge city, and just like Dallas, and there's all this stuff there, but it all seemed kind of sleepy and slow. And we were just trying to understand what was going on because we didn't know about how it was in the early '80s, in the '70s. So, but this photograph, I saw this when I first came to Houston, and it's a photograph by Paul Hester, who's the architecture photographer there, and they had an exhibition of his work at the Minot Collection, and it was a series of these photographs, and I was just struck by them because he sort of showed a new way of seeing Houston, because when I came in, we landed at Hobby Airport, drove up 45 to downtown, and it was just like, gross. But he makes it beautiful. You know, with this Magic Island, it's like a magic nightclub show place, and they put the Sphinx head on top of what was originally a really cool modern building that they made it look like Luxor. In the 80s, when they thought that was going to be a better idea than the modern building. But it just, the way he kind of shows the city and all of the weird things about it and the banal things about it, and mixes them together and makes it like it's shows what's special about it. And it makes you say, you stand back and you say, oh, well, what's going on here? This is really interesting. You know, freeway, oh, it's boring. Frontage roads, they're awful. But then you have this kind of weird juxtaposition, and it was a really cool way of seeing things. And it started to make me think about how I could understand Houston and Texas and cities like that more as I went through the program at Rice. When I first moved there, I lived in this condo in Montrose, and it's like a hipster area, and it was these cute little A-framed buildings that we assumed were built in the 60s, and ended up getting on the homeowners board. You know, I moved into the condo because I thought, I'm not going to do anything. But then they didn't do anything, and then the roofs kept leaking. And then I said, I got to be on the board because I want them to spend some money, because they're like, I don't want to spend any money to fix anything. So we had a contentious relationship, ended up becoming the secretary, so I got the checkbook. And we were having an argument about we need to do some painting. And so the building was one color, and they wanted to paint each unit a different color. And I didn't like the idea of that because I thought that wasn't what the building wanted to be. And so we were having a meeting, and then one of the guys on the board, he said, well, since you go to Fancy Pants Rice University, why don't you talk to Stephen Fox as the architectural historian? I think he knows a lot about Houston. I've heard about him before. He was an architecture guide. And so I go knock on his door. I don't know who he is. And I say, I live in this building at such and such address. And then he's like one of these kind of genius savant people. He instantly says, oh, that's Kipling Village Apartments. It was built in 1964. It was designed by this architect named Clovis Heimseth. And it was published in House and Home magazine in November 1964. And I said, what? And he said, yeah, go to the stacks and look. So I go to the stacks, I find the magazine, and there's a picture of it, and it's all one color, so I was right. And I go and I photocopy it. This is the photocopy from 1998. And I waved it in front of the guys and I said, look, we have to keep it the same color. But what the takeaway for me was that I just thought this was a building, like a nothing building. And then it turns out it was published in this national magazine for everyone in the country to see as an example of like cutting edge architecture and a model for residential living. And it was special. It wasn't just an average nothing thing. So I started thinking, before my idea of architecture was, it's the Empire State Building or the Eiffel Tower or whatever. It happens in places like Paris and New York, but Houston and Texas and the suburbs, it doesn't happen there. But then, I just had this moment of realization that it's everywhere. And you just need to learn how to see what you're looking at and then understand what it is. And so I really started to try to understand. And this whole process has been a way to learn how to understand what you're seeing and how to put value to things, because if you don't do that, then nothing really matters. So I found a copy of this book. It's called The Galveston That Was. And, in architecture, we look at buildings through the photographs. Like, that's how we see a lot of buildings, because they can't move, and sometimes you can't go to them. So you have to use images to see them to understand what's important about them. And so this book was really interesting to me because it has photographs by Ezra Stoller, who's one of the best architecture photographers in the United States in the post-war years, up there with Julius Schulman, and then also Henri Cartier-Bresson. So it was almost like its own graduate program, because they got sent to Galveston. It was like a bizarre project that the Menils funded to go and take pictures of the decrepit Victorian houses. This was in the 1960s, and this was when the buildings were in really bad shape, and Galveston was down on its luck, and they were losing buildings left and right. And the Menils architect that they like, Howard Barnstone, said, we need to do something. We need to document this and make it into some sort of call to action or something, because it would be a tragedy to lose all of this. So they gave him some money, and he was able to get those photographers to come in. And those were the best photographers in the country and the world. It was astonishing that they were brought in to do this project. It's just amazing the level of excellence that's included in this book. And so I just have two spreads from it, but this is my favorite project. So this is a synagogue that Nicholas Clayton designed. He's the premier Victorian architect in Galveston in the 1880s and 90s. And I don't have a before picture, but you can see the after picture. It doesn't look good, but there's still something to it. This is an Ezra Stoller photo, and it's perfectly composed. It's very serene. It's with the black sky. It's got super high contrast. You still have the cars parked in the front. He didn't try to get there one day when no one was around. But you can see the important parts of the building, the profile of it, the structure, the form of it, are very apparent in this image. And focus on those 6 little windows in the where the stained glass used to be. And you're like, oh no, that's a crummy building. But then you look at the rest of the building, and he's showing you how to see beyond the bad alterations, and also the poignancy of what they did, because even though the congregation doesn't have enough money to keep the building up, they're still using it and still trying to keep it as best they can. And so it shows you a whole bunch of different aspects of the building in the one image. And then it's paired with this image by Henri Cartier-Bresson, and here it's his typical decisive moment kind of thing, where the camera's askew and the kid's running across and the big tail fin looks crazy. But it's also, another really great way of seeing the building and the car and the arches. It all starts to come together and get you a sense of what the milieu was that they were trying to show was important for people. And the other thing that's valuable about this book is when they took these pictures, this was the nadir of appreciation for Victorian architecture, 1962 or whatever. This was Space Race getting started and all that. And this was we leave this for the dustbin of history. It doesn't matter if these things get knocked down. But they're no, we need to look at this. This is important. This is part of cultural heritage that we need to appreciate and try to do something about to keep it going forward. So after seeing that and being inspired and working more closely with Stephen Fox to understand modern architecture in Houston, I started just taking my own pictures, and I would see every day it seemed like something being demolished like this. This was Thompson McCleary's house, his architect, his own house. It was pristine, and they tore it down to build this like whatever Mediterranean McMansion thing. But I was like, I need to do something, like, because there are not going to be any buildings left at the rate they're going. So I started just instinctively taking pictures, and I started with a film camera, and wasn't sure what I was going to do, so I have some of these pictures still, and then it started to get to be expensive to develop them and cumbersome and have negatives and everything. So I switched to digital camera and started just going on taking pictures. And this coincided with, after I graduated, I started a group called Houston Mod, which Nate mentioned, to sort of advocate for the preservation and awareness of modern architecture in Houston, because at the time, the preservation community was very focused on pre-1945. Like, if it was built after 1945, they kick it to the curb. But anything before that, and there's hardly any of that left in Houston, it was precious. And so I got the sense that we needed to try to bridge the gap and focus on modern architecture, because there's people interested in it. There was a group of us, and Stephen Fox, again, is kind of like the puppeteer here, and I was doing my documentation. I did a thesis on 1950s modern houses in Houston that were like kind of like the equivalent of what I thought the case study houses were, like modest, low-cost modern houses that got published a lot in the local and national press. And then Anna Mott is a preservationist, and she was interested in modern architecture. She did a survey of modern buildings on a commercial strip in Houston with students from University of Houston. And then this guy named Michael Bridgeford, who lived in a kind of like an Eichler home type neighborhood and had done a documentation of his the houses in his neighborhood. So we came together, and we were all working independently, and we decided to try to start a group to get make our efforts stronger, like through cooperation. So we started Houston Mod, and Houston Mod 2003 continues to be active, and has done a lot of things over the years to get people to appreciate modern architecture in Houston. And part of their outreach has been architecture tours, which have been really interesting for me, particularly because I didn't go much outside of Houston. I didn't think much about the rest of Texas. It was a struggle for me to be interested in other places. But we did these tours, especially of South Texas, which I really never thought about. Brownsville, McAllen, Harlingen, right along the border. And they had a really thriving modern architecture scene from the 1940s up to the 70s and 80s. And I was just shocked. Like, we would go to Corpus Christi, and it was like you would see things that look like the Eames House down there, and they're all rusty and stuff, but it was like amazing to see all of this great architecture, as good as anything you would see anywhere in like Chicago or Los Angeles or whatever, in these towns, and realized how much modernism penetrated the culture of the state. Because Texas now seems conservative, and I mean, it's probably always been conservative, but now is more retrograde and not really embracing the future and modernism like it seemed like it used to. But I was just really, really struck by every time I went to one of these places, no matter how unpromising it seemed, there was always some just exquisite treasure waiting to be reappreciated, like just sitting out there in plain sight. And the Houston Mod, I was really happy they were able to do these tours, and I was able to go on them, because it really made me realize it's not just Houston has modern architecture, but everywhere. It's all over the place. Texas is just so full of it. And then I was on the State Board of Review for the National Register. I was asked to be on this. It's an advisory board for nominations for the National Register. So they would submit them, and then we would review them. And we would meet, the state preservation officer in Austin would set a meeting every 4 months for us, and we would go. He loved to meet in the most obscure places, so we would go all over the state and meet, and wherever there had been a recent National Register nomination, that's where our meeting would be. So we've been to like Canyon and Laredo and all sorts of other places. And we saw more architecture, and they actually paid for our travels. So that was nice. But so I would go talk to Steven sometimes before I would go and say, well, I'm going to Lubbock. Do you know anything about the building? And he'd have invariably these like lists that I've been able to share with Amy that are really impressive. I don't know how he does it, but I would just go and sort of do some research on Google Maps and look and see what looked interesting and go and start taking pictures. And I started to have so many that I was like, I need to share these. I don't just want to have them on my hard drive. So I started posting them to Instagram, and that was really interesting because people would come up to me and say, oh, I live in Laredo, and I see this house all the time. I drive past it when I go to the grocery store, but I didn't know it was like designed by an architect or it was famous or whatever. And so I was like, yeah, you just need to like learn how to look and see and understand. And sometimes it's easy and sometimes it's hard, but it's something that's really important to do. So the commentators and stuff on the Instagram posts would be like, are you working on a book? And I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just taking pictures of things that I like and enjoying my time doing this. And then the pandemic comes along, and I have a lot of free time. And so I'm like, I need to do something to like stop freaking out. So I'm going to just look at my pictures. And I had them all kind of like scattered on my hard drive. They weren't really organized or anything. So I was like, I'm gonna just organize them. It's gonna be like a therapeutic exercise for me. And I spent several months doing that, and I realized, I was like, maybe I do have something for a book. I'm not sure what, but there's a lot of pictures, and some of them I think are pretty good, not to blow my own horn, but I was like, I'm gonna try to do something with it. So I was thinking about what I would do as like some sort of a picture book, like the Galveston That Was, or something like that. And I thought about UT Press. They're really interesting because they have this kind of series that they've been doing on architecture in Texas that's really similar to what my idea was, but like a statewide kind of survey. And they started in the 60s with Texas homes of the 19th century. And again, it was a really ambitious project because they got Todd Webb to do the photography. And he's a documentary photographer who's ranked up there with Robert Frank, who did The Americans, the famous book. They just had an exhibition of his work at the MFA in Houston like last year, and we're pairing him with Robert Frank. But it's amazing that they were getting these people, and this was sponsored by the Amon Carter Museum. And so they sent him out, and he's in 1962 or 4, to document 19th century buildings. And I don't know what it was in the 60s, what was going on with the photography culture, but it was really outstanding. And so here's just a spread. Was a building in Clifton, and that house in Roma, which is near the border, or on the border actually. But the pictures are kind of extraordinary, I think. They're a weird kind of mixture of like ad hoc, kind of casual, but then also very carefully composed. But it was a beautiful series of photos, and then it has a sort of a simple text describing the buildings, but mainly it's a picture book, because the text is like at the end, and you just have this like spread of these pictures. And they followed it up with public buildings in the 19th century, which was the other part of Todd Webb's photography project. And so he took pictures of everything, but they did the houses first and then split it. And like this is in Fort Davis. You know, it's stunning. It's a beautiful photograph of those buildings. And this is my favorite one, this old hardware store in Flatonia that still in 1960 whatever had the potbelly stove, and you can imagine the guys with the corncob pipes sitting around and everything. But it's like such a stunning image, and you know, you look at it, the progression of space and how big it is, and the shadow kind of recesses. It's like transports you almost. It's a kind of a magical image to me. And then they continued the series. This is from 1993, so architecture in Texas from up to 1945. So I was like, oh, we're perfect. We'll be the third issue of this series. And so I talked to some people in Houston, and they put me in touch with the editor of UT Press, and I pitched the idea to him, and he really quickly said he was very excited about it. And I was like, oh my God, I feel like I got into college again or something. And so I was super excited. But he's like, but I don't want it to be Instagram captions. It needs to be like a real text by a historian. And I was like, oh, I don't know if I have it in me to do that, but I'll try. And I was like, no, I'm not gonna do it. And I thought about my colleague from the State Board of Review, whose name is Catherine O'Rourke, and she's an architectural historian. She used to be at Trinity in San Antonio, and now she's recently departed to go to Wellesley and head the art history department there. But I got to be kind of friends with her on the State Board of Review, and she gave a lecture. What I remember specifically, how I really was impressed by her, on postmodern architecture in Galveston, Texas. And again, this is one of those things that I was not interested in, but I went to the lecture, and she was able to really bring it to life, because they had Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown come in the 1974 and do a plan for the Strand, which is a historic street there with all the Victorian buildings on it. And she was talking about George Mitchell, who's an energy executive who bought a bunch of buildings and was like revitalizing them. And this is all kind of legacy of the Galveston That Was book, you know, because that book was only not even 10 years old when they started doing that stuff. So it all started to come to full circle. But she's such a great, captivating speaker, and was able to make this narrative that made it seem super interesting and really important and almost moving in a way. So I asked her, and I was like, oh, I don't think she's going to do this. But she did, and so we decided that I would make folders of all the best images that were edited and make this spreadsheet with all the names of the architects and the cities and all the information. And then she would make a narrative based on those images, and that's the way the book came about. It was a little bit backwards compared to the way they normally do it, but I think it turned out really well. And it was interesting for her because she was saying, this was also during pandemic, she had free time, and she had a book she was writing about like stuff in Europe or whatever, and she couldn't go, so she didn't have anything to do. And that's not really true, but it's kind of what she says. But she liked the idea of working with an architect, like someone who doesn't have the same kind of academic background like a historian. And she liked the idea of looking at pictures because she has a really good eye, and she was able to bring, I think, a really interesting way of organizing the book, and a way that I wouldn't have done, you know, with my architect hat on. So I think there's something very valuable about this collaboration that we had, and so we were really excited about it. And me going back to being an architect, I wanted it to be like a design exercise. So I wanted the book to have a graphic design and be, you know, a beautiful object in addition to the information that it conveys. And so I did fundraising and was able to get some money to pay for more than the regular UT Press graphic design, and we got to have extra pages, and I got to pick the printer and stuff like that. So it was a really great experience, and I was really happy to be able to do that. Like, it was a real privilege for me to be able to get the book to look the way I wanted to, and it was a real process also. Went through a couple graphic designers, and one of the things we really struggled with was the title, because we had this really stupid title like Texas architecture, something like that. And the graphic designer, Catherine had all these chapter headings, and he's like, your first 4 chapters, that's your book title. That's what you got to do. And so the first chapters, when you flip the book open, those of you that have the copies of it, you'll see right away where you got the name. So this was like a really serendipitous thing. So now I'm going to go stop blabbing about me and start telling you more about the book. So she starts off with history and mythology and Texas architecture. So she starts to establish like the scene about what architecture, modern architecture in Texas means, and she introduces it with this map. This is on a high school auditorium. It's a carved relief map of Texas, and to talk about places where there's privilege and not privilege, and architecture and not architecture. And then we go into some kind of pop culture references, both of which are in North Texas. These are one of the very few pictures that I did not take, but the beginning theme to Dallas, the TV show, and where you've got Campbell Center up there, very prominently featured, along with the Longhorns running across the dirt. And then this, the Texas pool in Plano. And she's problematizing things because the Texas pool, it's this great kind of act of bravado to make a swimming pool the shape of Texas, and in this subdivision, and a great marketing tool. But at the same time, it speaks to like the fears, because this was a segregated pool. Black people couldn't go here. And so it was like the mixing of the races and all this kind of things that weren't allowed, and what kind of people could go there and what kind of people couldn't go there. So she very gently kind of gets at some of those things, because it's not just a picture book, but she's talking about some of the ways that these buildings were conceived and what it would have meant for someone to see this versus a different type of person to see it. And the book is definitely about preservation, but unfortunately these are buildings that have been lost, that are in the book, that have been demolished since we started the project. So we have the American Bank and Bill Meade. This was, I don't know very much about Durwood Pickle, but I think this was his masterpiece. And a lot of people have told me they have seen this building a lot, driving back and forth, like it's near Waco. And this building to me is a tragedy, because banks in general are tough, because the way technology has changed, you don't need to have a banking hall anymore. You need to write checks or do the drive-through or anything, you can do it on your phone. So these big, grand kind of banking spaces like this, they need to find new uses for them, and they don't always do it. And here, the worst thing is they kept a branch there, but it's a little crummy branch that's like as big as like a Starbucks or something, because they don't need the space. So it was like a parody. It was this little circular building, but it was like, oh, come on, it's a shame, do something better. And then here's Howard Barnstone. This is, I think probably one of the best brutalist buildings in the state, and it was unceremoniously scraped a couple years ago, and they're building, it was on a large property, they're building a bunch of high-rise apartment towers there. And I was like thinking, I wish someone could have got in touch with the developers, because maybe they could have used the building like a restaurant or a clubhouse or something like that. Like, it seems like maybe if they didn't use the whole complex, because this was several buildings, it was like a campus, they could have at least used some of the most beautiful ones, like this one with this amazing staircase. But it was not to be. And then this one, this is Corpus. Corpus is the city that frustrates me the most sometimes. Corpus could be like Palm Springs. They have, I think, some of the best modern architecture in the state, and a lot of it, because the city started from nothing, and it peaked in 1970, and it's all the corporations that were there got pulled away in those years, and now it's it's just the blue collar workers now and the plant workers, but all the white collar people that were building these buildings aren't there anymore. Like Whataburger and H-E-B and Coastal, all those things aren't there anymore. But this was a really, again, a bank, problematic building. But we went on a Houston Mod tour of it the last week it was open, and we got to go inside, and it was still being used. I have another picture of it where you can see the drive-through was totally full. But they sold the bank, this property, to the Corpus Christi Transit Authority, and they were going to build a bus station, like a transit, like where 2 or 3 bus lines come together. It's like a shed. You'd stand there and wait for the next bus to come. And they were getting, this is preservation in action, they were getting federal money to do it. So when you do that, you got to do a Section 106 review. And that means that you got to look and see what historic resources are on the property. And if there's any that could be in the National Register, you have to either decide you can save them or remediate them or do some sort of equivalent action. So we started a Section 106 review to stop them from demolishing it. And the Transit Authority was like, what the hell? And because they had a consultant, but the consultant went and said, no building on the site has a historic plaque, so there's no historic buildings. But as long as the building is more than 50 years old, it's eligible, to be reviewed. And this was built in 1969, so it's more than 50 years. And we did a sort of a mock National Register application and sent it to them, and they're like, oh, geez, you're right, it is. We don't like it, but it is. And we went back and forth for a couple years, and finally, they were just utterly incredulous. And I was like, come on, this is a great resource. You could do all sorts of things with this building and make it into an amenity, and people would want to come and see it. And finally they said, okay, we'll just change the shape of the bus shed so we don't demolish the building. And they did that. And then they just boarded the building up, and I think purposely let people vandalize it. And after 2 more years, the FTC people came back and they relented, and they said, okay, we're just going to put a plaque up that says it was there, but now we're going to let them demolish it. So it was extremely frustrating experience, and I think both the advocates and the people in Corpus Christi, no one came out happy. But it just shows you, the struggle sometimes there is to get people to open their eyes and look and see the value of the buildings that are around them. So that speaks more to the purpose of the book. In the book, we purposely tried to do a range of buildings. So we've got, this very modest little doctor's clinic that we discovered in Longview that is a beautiful little optical optician's office. And we built in 1951. And when I went there, the last Dr. Childress was getting ready to close shop, and he said he was the last of 18 opticians in his family. And they didn't know what they were going to do with the building, but it was still all the furniture from 1951, the picky cypress walls, the lamps, the Swedish ceramic lamps that they bought when they moved in. It was beautiful. It was like a time capsule. But it was almost like a house. And you kind of see across the street, the little bungalow, the scale is real similar. It was just so touching to see this building. And then we have, of course, in Dallas, everyone's familiar with this building, really outstanding example of modern architecture, like a real total work of art with the collaboration of artists and architects coming together to make a really beautiful space. Some of the photographs, sometimes they're a little bit cheeky. This one on the left is a church in Abilene, and right next to it is abandoned Whataburger, and it's hard to tell which is which. So this kind of speaks to some of the weirdness of modern architecture. When you look at a church with a pointed roof and a steeple and narrow windows, I think most people know it's a church. But in the 1950s and 60s, they broke away from that, and they started making churches all sorts of different shapes. And one of the shapes was A-frame roof. And Whataburger also decided they wanted to make something that would stand out, and they chose A-frame roof too. And so the shape of the building, it doesn't really have any inherent meaning to it. It catches your eye, but it doesn't really say, I'm a fast food restaurant, or I'm a church. Like that's one of the ambiguities of modern architecture, and sometimes I think people struggle with that. And that's also what I think is fascinating about like how the meaning of building shapes and forms has evolved in the post-war years. This one, this classic kind of one of those juxtaposition photos where you've got the big tall skyscraper aloof on its plaza, and then you've got the little, well, it's not very little, but the antebellum courthouse in Galveston. So here's very quickly, I'm not going to go through too much of it, but you can see how she organized the book. And you see the first 4 chapters, and then it gets a little bit more abstract as we go through the book, and then we go with what we save and why, like a call back to order for the real purpose of the book. So we start with home, and I mean, I love houses and residences and dwellings. They're fascinating to me, the intimacy that's involved in them and domestic life. So we wanted to show the variety, like the way the Whataburger and the church, the shape can be all sorts of different things. The way people live isn't always the same as what it used to be. So the introduction here, we have a picture of Allen Parkway Village, which was a housing project built by the federal government in 1942 in Houston. It's the largest housing project in the South. It had like 1,000 units. It's huge. It's like the size of a subdivision. And there has been a protracted fight since the 80s up to the 2000s. I'm not going to go into it, but they demolished 2/3 of it. This was, again, all sorts of Section 106 type stuff. It was a Pyrrhic victory, but they've got a section of it that's still intact. And you can see it's really good shape, like those original windows, the doors. This is a concrete framed building, even though it's only 2 stories tall, because it was supposed to last for 100 years, because that was one of the stipulations with the federal government when they built these things. And then they replaced it with these 2x4 houses, and they've had to put new hardy siding on them just last year, and they're only 20 years old. Here's another showing the variety of housing in Texas and the richness of what they were doing in the post-war years. But this building on the left is in Gladewater, which is it's near Kilgore. It's like halfway between Longview and Tyler. But you go to this town, and it's this little kind of Victorian little railroad town. It's got a railroad track and some Victorian buildings up and down the railroad track. It's fine, it's nice, but it's nothing remarkable. But then like about maybe a half a mile outside of the town, you see this amazing building just like built all by itself on the side of the highway that connects the two bigger cities together. And it's just this like surreal kind of moment to see this, because this looks like something, from Mussolini's Rome or something. Like, it's so grand and it's huge. It's like really tall. It's got the clock on it. It's symmetrical. It's got these great big porches wrapping all around it. It's an amazing building, and it's just shows you like the richness of the architecture. And then this is just a beautiful. I love this house, the Anderson Todd's house. It's Philip Johnson saw this house when it was built. He was friends with Anderson Todd, and he said, "This is more me's than me's." And they got published in a magazine that way, the little quip. But it's just, the house is just stunning, and it shows you just the loving care and the beauty, and I wish I had more detailed pictures of it, but just the exquisite construction and the craftsmanship that have gone into this house are just, it's really, really wonderful to see that. Here's a couple from Dallas. This Mayflower Investment Company built a bunch of really cool Art Deco kind of modern houses that I think, they almost look like something from that Jacques Tati Playtime movie, like so playful with the little curved stair and the little pergola or the little porch with the hole in the roof that makes it so it doesn't actually give you any shade. It's just like, it's a great little house. I love it so much. And then you've got, Howard Meyer's maybe second magnum opus after Temple Manuel. But when I actually went and looked at it closely, like I never really noticed like the detail in the Brise Soleil, like the screens, how they overlap and they're like almost like tessellated. It almost seems like they could be sliding back and forth and moving or something, but it's amazing the way that the kind of detail that you see in some of these things when you start to look at them some more. I'm going to talk a little bit about heat. This is another chapter that both Catherine and I are excited about because we get to talk about Brise Soleil, and which are the sunshades. And we also, in addition to those obvious things, you have this kind of house that doesn't seem very assuming, but it was built to be part of an exhibition, like a propaganda thing for air conditioning. And this was when air conditioning was still not very common, and it was called Air Conditioned Village. And they had, 25 or 30 houses up and down and the street, and they had each house, this was the Chrysler Air Temp house, was sponsored by a different air conditioner manufacturer. And they were doing a study. They would made the people that bought the houses like fill out little applications and questionnaires to see how the air conditioning worked after the first couple of years. And but it was fascinating to see like the kind of study and rigor they were doing to understand, is air conditioning a good idea or not? Like, of course, it seems pretty obvious now, but then they weren't sure. Here are some other examples of ways to do passive cooling. You know, you've got this really fun little parasol made out of concrete with some mosaics, and when it was in better shape with the light bulbs working, it was probably pretty fun over there in Laredo. And then this obvious water gardens in Fort Worth with the water, like showing how you can do stuff to make the environment more comfortable through architectural means. Here, a really classic building with a Brise Soleil, and we put it with this picture of all the power outages in Houston. We have a real problem with CenterPoint, and we have energy insecurity now, and maybe we need to start thinking about ways to do passive cooling to help reduce the burden on the energy grid, which doesn't seem to be very good anymore. Here, sports and leisure, we're showing how really important events happened. You know, not just Friday Night Lights stuff, but here at Rice Stadium, JFK gave the "We Choose to Go to the Moon" speech in 1962 that started the mission to the moon and fighting the Russians and trying to beat them after the Sputnik setbacks and everything. So it's funny because he says, why does Rice play UT? Because it's difficult. Why do we choose to go to the moon? Because it's difficult. But Rice, even then, no one went to the stadium. It's empty. Even when the president comes. It's too big, but it's a beautiful building. It's probably, maybe my favorite building on the campus, and they've been trying to demolish it for the past 25 years. Ever since I was going there, they've been trying to figure out a way to take it down, but they haven't done it yet. So maybe if this is included in the book, we can stop that from happening. Here, some more examples of like fun leisure time projects. And the book, as an architect, I really was focusing on buildings that I thought were designed by architects, because I jumped through a lot of hoops to become an architect and be able to call myself that. And I feel that architects do important work and should be celebrated for what they do. So I really wanted to foreground buildings by architects. And we don't have a lot of vernacular buildings in the book, and there's certainly a lot of them that are great, but we did include the tap, and we couldn't not. And this was about 8:30 in the morning, and she was asking me if I wanted a beer, and she was walking out there. And then we have this beautiful building in Edna, which is South Texas, another just monument. This is, Ernest Schultz did a lot of theaters for the Interstate Theater Company, and this, I think, was his masterpiece. It's just a stunning composition, and they've kept it in pretty good shape, and they're really proud of the name of their town. They've also got it written all over the police station, a couple other buildings there. Here, you can't not talk about the Astrodome, like the first indoor fully enclosed, air-conditioned space, stadium, whatever you want to call it, which is now a preservation nightmare. This is what it looks like now. It's abandoned. This is more Section 106 stuff. They've gotten it listed in the National Register as Texas State Antiquities, recorded Texas Historic Landmark. I think maybe even not City of Houston landmark, but they tried to. The Historic Commission, this is before me, they caved in. They were too scared to do it. But they've got it so that they can't really demolish it, but there's not money now to fix it, so it kind of sits there. And they kept a section of the orange and yellow seats. This was part of the National Register listing requirement. So you've got this like flash of color, and then everything else is just the concrete. So hopefully there's something happening. There's stuff in the works, but it's a fight because it's a difficult building because it's controlled by the Houston Rodeo, the Houston Texans, and oh gosh, I forget now. But there's 3 people fighting over it, so it's a tricky building. It's owned by the county, so it's not a regular building. Here we've got the El Dorado Ballroom. This is a preservation success story. This building was just languishing, and there's an advocacy group called Project Row Houses, which is this is a historically black neighborhood, and they've been doing work. I don't know how they did it, but they got like $12 million, and they fixed up the building. They've got programming in it. They've done an addition to it. They've fixed all the windows, and they made it look like 1939 again. And it was kind of like that building in Galveston where they had like filled in all the windows. Here is some fun, another kitsch building, and the Teepee Motel. Apparently the people that built that, oh, that's the wrong caption. They built that, he won the lottery and used the money and bought a whole bunch of grain storage silos and converted them into this motel. Here's because the teepee motels, there's some other teepee motels that were more popular that actually look like real teepees that he was competing with. Here we have a Conoco station. I love these things. You see them more in South Texas, but they all look the same, and they got this really cool curved profile. The cars would drive through the back of them, and this is in Corpus Christi. They're using it now. They've repurposed it to be a dry cleaning place. And then this last one, this was, I think Catherine just liked this picture. I do too. But it's the El Capitan Hotel in Van Horn. So this kind of speaks to modern leisure and travel. So in the 1930s, they were trying to get people to go to Big Bend National Park. It had just been designated. And so they built a series of motels at all of the entrances to it, like within a day's drive of it. So there's like 5 or 6 of these up and down, the Hotel Paisano and the Gage Hotel and some other ones. But this one I think is a really cool one. And it had fallen on hard times, and new owners bought it, and they've done a really great job of putting it back together. Precious objects. In the post-war years, museums became a really important building type, I think more so than before then, and kind of supplanted like churches and things like that. So we've included, of course, the Menil collection, which I just love. I think it's perfect. And then we've got the Kimball. You know, I think modern museum culture in Texas is really the Kimball and the Menil collection. Those are really great buildings of national importance. And then this kind of like dark horse one, again in Corpus, was the Museum of South Texas. This is a really great design by Phil Johnson, and it's built right on the bay, and it's got these windows, and you see the tankers going by. It's a wonderful example of how to site a building. Okay, I'm wrapping up. So here we go back, we do the call to order, what we save and why. You know, here's a Texas Architect magazine, 1976. Where they're already talking about this kind of stuff. Like, we need to stop wasting our resources and save some of these things, not just modern buildings, but all buildings. But this picture that we used to introduce the section is a really great project. It's a conversion of an old 1920s Tudor-style hospital in Austin, and they put this slipcover over it and then made it into apartments. And if you look very closely behind the slipcover, you can see the Tudor entryway that they used to go into when it was the hospital. And then we've got a couple success stories. So here's Mission Control. They recently did a really great, very, very thorough restoration. They even went to find the ashtrays and the wheels for the seats on the chairs that look like they did in 1969. Like, it's an amazing recreation of what it was like when the Apollo was going off. And then in East Texas, another kind of an interesting little project. This is a building that was slip covered. You couldn't even tell what it was, but it's this very strange little bus station, and with this addition that's super cool on the Pilates that for decades no one even knew it was there, and then someone took the cover off and got it listed in the National Register and used tax credits to help fund the restoration of it. Because if you get a building listed in the National Register, you can get tax credits up to like 45% of the construction budget to help offset the cost of rehabilitation. And that's turned out to be a really great way to do preservation in Texas and all over the country. So with that, I will sit down in the chairs, and Amy and I will have a few more projects to look at.
I'll ask you to be brief, and we'll try to run through a few of these and show off some more of your photographs.
Okay.
For the audience, I started following Vin's account in 2016, and it really sparked my imagination and my curiosity about Texas history, and eventually the idea for Mod Texas came to me with the idea that a bunch of strangers could get together on the internet and crowdsource a collection that might inspire people to care about preservation in their own communities. And that's what's brought us here tonight. So jumping right in, a notable trait of the post-war era was a tendency towards conformity. Suburbia and the little boxes made out of ticky-tacky little boxes, all the same. But thankfully there were some architects who were eager to buck that trend. Will you talk about a few of them?
Sure. Oh, we got to it. Okay, so these are two projects in Houston, but I love them. The first one is Ralph Anderson's house. Ralph Anderson was a principal at a big architecture firm in Houston, but he also happened to be gay. And in the 1960s, that was tough. So he built this house for himself and his partner, and it's a courtyard house, and it has the front, no windows. And inside, all mirrors and kind of Paul Rudolph-y looking stuff. But we actually, when we were doing research for the book, got in touch with someone who's still alive that was friends with him in the 1950s and 60s. And he would say that Ralph and Gilbert, his partner, would drive into you drive around the back to the garage behind the house. Gilbert would have to sit in the seat and fold over so that the neighbors couldn't see that he was sitting there with him. And he would get out of the car, and then they would go into this house. But the house got published in magazines, and it was like coded as a gay man's house because they were like, oh, Ralph Anderson, a confirmed bachelor, and house not for the nook and cranny conscious, and a house not for children, and all these kind of maybe. Then people didn't realize, but now it's like beating you over the head, saying who the person was living in this house. So it's fascinating to see, this kind of a closed off house. But then at the same time, I have to say it's perverse because there's two-story traditional. This is an old neighborhood, like a 1920s neighborhood. There's two-story houses all around, so everyone can see in the courtyard. So it's like he's like, oh, don't look at me, but look at me at the same time. And then the house doesn't have any windows, but it clearly draws attention to itself because it's so different from all the other houses. So it occupies this really wonderful, ambiguous kind of place in the neighborhood and the culture, how he negotiated that position he had to live in. And then this other one is a house by John Chase. John Chase was Texas's first black registered architect. He's a real trailblazer, and his house is also very unusual. And interestingly enough, he also chose to build a courtyard house, and he built this atrium addition on it in the 1960s, and it's definitely another standout house. And it's also important because a lot of like black politicians and business leaders, they would meet at this house, like Mickey Leland and Barbara Jordan, and all these people, and the Manils would go there, and they would have these great events. And we have this drawing of the interior because his wife lived there until she died in like 2021 or 22, and they put the house up for sale. And I was begging and pleading because we were working on the book. I was like, I gotta get in the house, I gotta get in the house. So I was calling the real estate agent like every day. I was like, please, just 5 minutes, just let me take a picture of the living room. Because we want to include it in this book, and it's gonna be the canon for Texas architecture. We're celebrating the house, and they just wouldn't do it. They were afraid. They were like, I don't know, you're gonna do something, and then they're not gonna want to buy the house if they put it for sale. So I never got to go inside, so that's why we have the drawing. And then the people that bought it, they wrecked it. They painted the brick, they painted it. They put plastic laminate over the terrazzo floors, they glued them to the floors. They ripped all the cabinets out, they put Home Depot cabinets in, and then they had the nerve to put it on an architecture tour. And they wondered why they didn't get positive reaction. And I was like, oh, gee, that's so disappointing. But that's, you win some, you lose some.
Catherine writes of Paul Rudolph that he was a somewhat disliked architect because of the, quote, foreboding formality and ponderousness of some of his building exteriors. We have the Bass House in Fort Worth and Broccolo Plaza off of I-35 as some of his North Texas legacy. What do you find interesting about those projects?
I love, Paul Rudolph is one of these architects that I think you like him or maybe you hate him, I don't know. Like Frank Lloyd Wright is a very polarizing kind of figure. And he did these really late modern buildings, but he did them like very, very convincingly. And he would take like two materials and then do all sorts of like things with them that you didn't think you could do. And I find that really fascinating. Like this was all before computers, like the building particularly in Amarillo, and that's kind of like a little simple building compared to some of the other things he's done. But how he made the buildings do that and how he keep track of everything, this 3D spatial imagination he must have had was really, really outstanding. And the commitment to doing these kind of buildings, he never wavered. Like he did that all the way up until the end. He died in 1997 and was still doing the same kind of buildings all the way to the end. The Brook Hollow Plaza, this building is kind of like a great big Lego set. Those are all prefabricated pieces, and they put a crane and they all put them together, and they thought it was going to revolutionize construction, but they only built one, and it was so expensive they didn't build the rest of them because there were supposed to be 4 or 5 buildings on this site. And now it's been rehabilitated and it's used as elderly housing for the elderly. So that's a good success story. They've kept it up pretty well. It's recognizable compared to other things that have happened to other buildings.
Concurrent with the rise of better living through science, atomic bombs, and the Cold War space race was a powerful desire for spiritual enrichment. Could you talk a little bit about churches and those kinds of buildings and how they changed in the mid-century?
Sure. And it's, we talked a little bit about that church in Abilene, but the Church of the First Scientist in Victoria, that's, I think, my favorite little church building in Texas. I just love this thing. It's so weird, and it's got this like organ behind that glass window. It's like an amazing building, and it hits all the buttons for me because it's modest, it's got great materials, it's got really clear tectonics, like all the beams and the columns are exposed. It's in this Victorian neighborhood. There's like great big column houses on either side of it, but it just fits so nicely into the neighborhood because of the scale and the massing of it. This other building, Greenwood Mausoleum, this was designed by Harwell Hamilton Harris, who was a Frank Lloyd Wright disciple, and it's a very moving. A lot of times people struggle with mausoleums and cemeteries. We're not really great at that kind of architecture. And this is a really beautiful example of that. And it's 4 buildings connected together, and they're hollow in the center, and they've got courtyards in them, and they've got the grave sites inside of them. And it's a really moving and beautifully detailed building with this simple little arch and a little bit of decor around the front, but then the rest of the building just the solid limestone slabs.
Our 1978 Dallas City Hall was featured in the chapter on government buildings. The Landmark Commission here has just begun the designation process. Our architecture critic Mark Lamster said of the concrete behemoth, quote, "To its many detractors, it is inhumane, overbearing, cold, depressing, anti-urban, and just plain ugly." I'd love to know what you think about it.
Well, I see it as a courageous building, and to make such a statement is really brave and laudable. And a lot of times buildings now, city halls, like Houston has a dinky little miniature skyscraper city hall from the 1930s. It's not nearly as much of a monument as this. And I'm doing my art history thing here. I got a picture of the Palace of Justice at Chandigarh, which this building's inspired by. But it's amazing that he was taking Ayaan Pei, the architect, this building that Corbusier designed, but then moving it to Texas, but doing so many of the same elements, like the long horizontal section, and then the entrance with the vertical elements accentuating them, and the big plane in front of it. And we don't see the fountain, but there's the big basin of the water. And so it's a really fascinating example of the way people would adapt a form and use it for something else. And here it's a government building. And I think here, this building does look like a government building. Like, it looks like something, this is an expression of power and authority. And it's a really good example of that. Like, it seems to convey its meaning very clearly, and I really appreciate that, because sometimes things don't always look like what they actually are.
In 1960, Norcell Haywood was only the second African American to graduate with an architecture degree here in Texas. Catherine calls him out for helping to, quote, "pioneer socially conscious, community-oriented design practices." You photographed several of his projects. Would you talk about them?
Sure. I think Norcell Haywood's really interesting because John Chase was the first architect, and he was the pioneer, but because he was the pioneer and he was in the 50s, he couldn't get hired by an architect, and he had to work on his own. And so he never got the mentorship. And you learn so much when you work for another architect versus just going to school and coming out and designing stuff. And so John Chase's work is kind of all over the place, and it kind of speaks to his situation. But Norcell Haywood worked for O'Neill Ford and Partners, and O'Neill Ford was a really good mentor because he was very kind of hands-off in a lot of ways, and he relied a lot on the principals and the chief designers to work on projects. And so he would hand them off to different people while he went and did his job getting. And so Norcell Haywood did a bunch of projects, and these are, the one on the far side is a library at this really great school campus in Kingsville, which is in South Texas, and it's probably got 20 buildings on it, and he did 3 or 4 of them. But you can really see where he's like understanding the design ethos of O'Neill Ford and the kind of wood and the structure, the clarity of it, and the Mexican influence, like, not that the lamps are Mexican, but made out of ceramics, and the colors and materiality of everything. And then when he went on his own, he was able to take that in this Antioch Missionary Church, which is in San Antonio, and really carry that forward. And then later buildings develop his own language that's really kind of like rich and powerful. And so it speaks to, I think O'Neill Ford's generosity, but also Norcell's really inherent talent and ability, and the time, because 10 years made a huge difference, because John Chase didn't get to do any of these things. but then Haywood got to do them. And so, things were slowly improving in a lot of ways.
Given your extensive travels across the state, you visited everything from the Indian Lodge in Fort Davis to the Fredonia in Nacogdoches and the Statler here in Dallas. Is that where you're staying tonight?
No, I'm not.
Okay. For those who might be interested in taking a road trip this summer, is there a restored accommodation you'd recommend they visit?
Well, we have two here. So here you have the one on the far side, the Echo Motel, which is unrestored but still used as a hotel. And this is a really interesting project. It's in Edinburgh, and it's designed by J.N. McCammon, who does the Meadows building just down the road from here. And he did a lot of hotels in the 1950s, and this hotel was actually built by a consortium of concerned citizens who didn't think there was enough tourism in Edinburgh. And so they built this building, and it's got this big, lanai courtyard thing with pool and palm trees and stuff that are on the other side of the building. But they built it with subscription. They all paid money, and they could go and use it like a country club. And it's still a community corporation that way. So it's really interesting to see how it's still being used. And then the one on the left, the Fredonia, was a similar idea. And this was in Nacogdoches, and it was named after the Fredonia Republic of Fredonia, like they seceded from Texas or something. And it's a mythical state for them. But it's a similar kind of community endeavor where the citizens all bought stock in the building because they thought they needed more tourism there. But this building was recently restored very, very well, and it's definitely worth staying at. It's a very nice hotel.
I'm hoping that our conversation tonight might inspire some of our attendees to join us in documenting modernism for Mod Texas. And I'm wondering if you have any advice for photographers who are thinking about joining the effort.
Just open your eyes. I think there's a lot of resources out there. It does take a lot of work, and it's something that you can do casually, you can do it very diligently, but there's a lot of things now that make it easier, like Google Street View and Google Earth. A lot of the newspapers have lots and lots of information about buildings because they used to be very active in publishing local architecture. So I did a whole period of time where I was going through microfilm of real estate section of newspapers in Houston. But that's all been digitized now, and you can get a subscription to newspapers.com or one of those things, or if you're a member of the library, maybe you have free membership to it. But you can find a building that you think is cool, look up the address, and then try to see if there's a newspaper article about it, or Sanborn maps, or there's all sorts of different ways to go about finding stuff. Go through the Avery Index and look up like magazine articles about buildings, architecture guides. Dallas has an architecture guide that hasn't been updated in a while, but it's good. There's a series of books called Buildings of Texas that have sort of thumbnail portraits, like an architecture guide to the whole state. It's a 2-volume set. That's been incredibly valuable. And then there's all sorts of local initiatives. Like when we were Houston Mod, we've written books about architecture in Houston, and there's lots of other places where people have done books like that, and you can find out information that way.
And I would add, pulling over is the first step.
Yes.
You can add layers of research or post online, and folks can help crowdsource some of the background about those buildings. But the first step is just to pull over when you see something interesting and start shooting.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Given your time on the Texas Historic Commission and working with Houston Mod, do you have any advice for people in the audience who might be interested in getting involved in preservation issues?
Yeah, learn the rules. It really matters how the rules work, because to save a building, I found the only thing that matters is local historic designation. You can get in the National Register and all this stuff and try to do Section 106, but there's always workarounds somehow, it seems, for those things. The real way to save a building is to get it listed as a local landmark. And with that, you got to get in touch with the preservation office if there is one in your town. And some places have it, some places don't. But those are the kinds of things you have to find out about because it requires a lot of going to meetings and lobbying and talking to council members. And if you're rich, you could buy the building and save it, but that's not something we all get to do. And but it is a lot of community effort and talking to people and being involved at different levels. And it takes some dedication, but I found really getting in with the preservation office is the best thing to do to save buildings.
Thank you. Nate, do we have time to go to the audience for questions?
2 questions.
2 questions, all right. Yes.
You've been at this for a while, but the book, Live Houston, Live Texas, is fantastic. Have you had any recent just aha surprises or something that you haven't seen?
I'm going to repeat that question. In essence, he's asking, have you seen anything that's been a great surprise recently to you?
Well, yes, actually. I was in Austin, we were giving a talk, and I went to this isn't really modern, but we went to the Charles Moore House, and I emailed them, and the guy running it, Kevin Kime, who's been there forever, was like, oh yeah, come by. And I went over there, and that was an amazing house. I was shocked because I didn't think I liked Charles Moore, but it was really, really fascinating to see it. And I was just thrilled for like several days. I was excited after I saw it.
Any other questions? Yes.
So my mom was born in Corpus Christi, and I've never heard anyone sort of talk about the city before. And I was struck by what you said about it being like Palm Springs.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to just ask you to expand on that.
Well, Corpus Christi is the only city in Texas that's built facing the water. It's on the bay, and every other city like Galveston faces towards the mainland. So it's unusual in that respect. Like, it's the only city that's kind of like a tropical exotic paradise, and it's not exactly, but it's in that direction. Palm Springs not in a good location either, right? You shouldn't live in the desert. It's not inhabitable. But it's got this bluff, and it's got buildings up and down, and it's got Padre Island and Aransas, and so it's got this whole kind of like tropical vibe going on. It's generally pretty warm there, and I think of all these cities, like it could be like a Palm Springs type thing, like a nice, modest-sized city with great modern architecture, pretty affordable, the way Palm Springs used to be, and has so much potential that way that it just frustrating to see the way that the people that live there don't see that, and they don't seem to understand. Like it's lost on so many of them. And so, but there's a great book about Corpus Christi you should read called Where Texas Meets the Sea that talks about the history of Corpus Christi and the problems it has with like understanding its value of its own self and its location and everything, because it's a special city.
I was born in Corpus and finally made my way there a few months ago to document, and it was great to see and confer with my parents about some of the buildings that are gone now. Well, thank you all so much for coming to be with us this evening. Thank you, Ben, to you and Catherine for all the work that you put into this book and for making the time to come to be with us in Dallas. I understand there are 7 books left out front if anybody would still like to buy a book. And if you've already made a purchase, Ben will meet you outside and sign it for you. Thank you all so much for coming. We appreciate you.